The look and feel of linen is so distinct and pleasant, and today was a real treat sewing with the beautiful Lovebird linen in a medium weight from fabricstore.com. Today's pattern is also from fabricstore.com, the Riva long sleeve top. I received my pattern in the mail, and I love that it's delivered in a sturdy tube and printed on professional plotting paper with 4 sizes printed clearly on the roll. There's also a detailed and fully illustrated instruction booklet, a pattern card for easy reference, and a pattern hook so you can hang up your pattern like the pros. This Riva pattern collection features a blouse with long or short sleeves, pants, and shorts. We are sewing the long sleeve view today with a unique back pleat, sleeve plackets, a collar, and a beautiful bias tape finish on the inner neckline. This pattern is rated advanced, but with the help of the illustrated booklet and a video sew-along such as this, sewists of any level can successfully sew this top. We'll go through it today step by step. I'm sewing a size 2 in this video, and in addition to the 2 yards of linen fabric and coordinating thread, I used about a ½ yard of fusible woven interfacing and 9 1/2-inch buttons. Join me today in sewing a classic and comfortable shirt. Let's get started. Here is the top of my back bodice piece, and I'm ready to form the pleats. Along the top neckline, we have 4 notches. With the right side of the fabric facing me, I'm going to take the rightmost notch and carry it over to the first notch on the other side of the center back. Once those notches meet, I'll pin them in place. Then I'll take the outermost notch on the right side and carry it over to the other notch on the opposite side of the center back. Now that those notches are on top of each other, I'll pin through all layers. Then I'll continue pinning through all layers along that center back area. Now I'll sew this center back section in place with a 1/4-inch seam allowance. Here is one of my yoke pieces with the right side facing me. I'll place the wrong side of my back bodice piece onto the right side of the yoke piece, aligning the top straight edge. Then I'll place my remaining yoke piece right sides together with the back bodice piece. So now both of our yoke pieces are technically right sides together with the back bodice sandwiched in between. And we'll pin through all layers along that top edge. Then we can sew this seam with a 1/2-inch seam allowance. Then I'm going to press both of my yoke pieces upward, out and away from the back bodice, so that the yoke pieces are now wrong sides together, and I'll give that yoke seam a good press. I'm going to top stitch on the yoke side of the garment straight across from side to side with a 1/16 seam allowance. Before we start attaching the front bodice pieces to the back yoke, I'm going to take the back layer of the yoke and fold it underneath so that it's out of the way. Now I have full access to the top shoulder edges of the outer yoke piece, with its right side facing me. Now I'll place my front bodice pieces right sides together with the back yoke, aligning the shoulder seams and pinning in place. Then we can sew our shoulder seams with a 1/2-inch seam allowance. With the front and back bodice pieces still right sides together, I'm going to start rolling them together from the bottom until they reach the shoulder seams that we just created. Place the remaining inner yoke piece and place it so that its right side faces the wrong sides of the front bodice piece. So now the yoke pieces are technically right sides together with the front bodice pieces sandwiched in between. Pin those shoulder seams. Then we can sew along the previous stitching line with a 1/2-inch seam allowance to attach the inner yoke piece. Now we can pull out all of the bodice material from in between the yoke pieces so that the shirt is turned right side out. And we'll give our shoulder seams a good press. Now we can top stitch with a 1/16 seam allowance just as we did previously, top stitching the shoulder seams on the yoke side of the garment. Now to prevent the neckline materials from stretching, we're going to stay stitch. We're going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance along the entire raw edges of the neckline. I've applied interfacing to the wrong sides of one set of placket pieces. Now I'm going to take them to the ironing board, fold them and press them in half, wrong sides together, just to create a memory crease. Then we can unfold those creases for now. I transferred the slit marking for my pattern piece onto the wrong side of the bottom of my sleeve with a tracing wheel and tracing paper. Then I went over those traced marks once again with a heat erasable pen so it's a little bit more visible. I'm going to take the rectangular piece. I'm going to transfer a stitching line onto the interface side so that the stitching line starts 1/2 inch from the top edge of the placket, then continuing to mark a vertical line 1/2 inch away from that raw edge. I'll pin the right side of this piece to the wrong side of the sleeve, aligning the raw edge with the vertical edge transferred to the bottom of the sleeve. I'll also align the bottom edges and pin in place. I also want to transfer a stitching line to the opposite placket piece. Once again, transferring a 1/2 inch seam allowance that starts 1/2 inch away from the top edge. And I'll pin this piece in place so that the raw edge once again aligns with the vertical line transferred to the sleeve. Aligning the raw edges and pinning in place. Now I'm going to sew along my transferred stitching lines, back stitching at both points to secure. Cut a slash along the line that we transferred to the bottom of the sleeve, following that Y shape, and when we get to the top, be careful not to cut into the stitching of the plackets. Now take this piece to the ironing board and we're going to fold and press those outer edges of both placket pieces to the wrong side by 1/2 inch. After we've done that, we'll also press the top edge of the longer placket piece to the wrong side by 1/2 inch. Now I'm going to turn the sleeve to the right side and pull each of those placket pieces to the front. Then I'm going to press those placket seam allowances toward their respective placket pieces. Now I'm going to take the shorter rectangular placket piece and fold it along its pre-pressed creases, so that we have a clean finish when we fold it over its seam allowance. And pin that in place. We're going to edge stitch this piece from top to bottom with a 1/16 seam allowance, starting 1/2 inch away from the top edge of this placket piece, all the way to the bottom, backstitching at both points to secure. I'm going to take the opposite placket piece and place it on top of the shorter placket piece so that the line that we originally pressed into the center aligns with the outer edge of that opposite placket piece. And I'll pin it in place at the bottom so it stays in place. I'm going to take the top part of the sleeve and fold it backwards along the top of the placket area so that all of the material at the bottom of the sleeve is right sides facing me. I also want to make sure that that tiny triangle at the top of our placket pieces is facing upward. I'm going to pin this tiny triangle to all of the placket material underneath. Then I'm going to sew along the base of the triangle from one end to the other, backstitching at both points to secure. We can lay that sleeve piece out flat once more and refold and press all of the creases back into our main placket piece. Now that we have that outer placket piece laying nicely on top of the inner piece, I'm going to start my stitching at this outer open edge of this main placket piece, sewing horizontally at the point where our previous placket stitchings began. I'm going to sew straight across, then sew with a 1/16 seam allowance up and around the top edge to create a rectangle. Once I'm back where my stitching started, I'm going to sew down that open edge of the placket again with a 1/16 seam allowance. Now for the pleats along the bottom of the sleeve, we have notches indicating where we're going to be matching those lines. I'm going to take the material at the outermost notch, move it over to the notch next to it, and pin the material in place. And I'll do the same for the next set of notches. Now that the pleats are pinned, I'm going to stitch them in place along that bottom raw edge with about 1/8 inch seam allowance. Here's my front and back bodice pieces opened out away from each other at the shoulder seam. And I'm going to start placing the sleeve in place. I'm going to place my sleeve right sides together with the arm side and pin in place matching the notches. And repeat to pin your other sleeve in place. Sew both of these seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges together, and press the seams toward the main garment. Now here is the seam that we just created to attach the sleeve, and I've pressed that seam allowance toward the bodice. Top stitch along the bodice side of the garment, catching that seam allowance underneath with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Place the front and back bodice pieces and the sleeves right sides together. And we'll pin together the side seam and the underarm seam. We'll sew from the bottom of the sleeve across that underarm seam to the bottom of the garment with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Finish the raw edges together once again and press the seam toward the back of the garment. Then repeat all of these steps to sew your opposite side seam and underarm seam. I've applied interfacing to the wrong sides of both of my cuff pieces. Now we're going to stay stitch across the top edges with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, paying attention to where your notches are so that you're stay stitching the top edges for the mirrored pair. Now we're going to fold each of the cuff pieces in half right sides together, and then sew both of the side edges from the bottom to the stay stitching that we sewed previously, using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to press the stay stitched side down along the stitching line to the wrong side by 1/2 inch, and also press those 1/4 inch side seams to the wrong side as well. Turn both of your cuffs right side out, poking out the bottom corners. pressing them nicely once again. Now I'm going to turn my sleeve inside out, and I'll line up the raw edges of the exposed seam for the corresponding cuff so that its right side faces the wrong side of the sleeve. I'll align the folded edge of the cuff with the edge of the placket and pin in place, matching the notches. Repeating to also pin the opposite cuff to the opposite bottom of the sleeve. Sew straight across both of those cuff seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, careful not to catch that opposite folded edge of the cuff. Turn our sleeves right side out and press those seam allowances down toward the cuff. Now with that seam allowance pressed downward and inside the cuff, I'm going to place the remaining open edge of the cuff on top of that seam allowance so that we cover the main stitching line, and pin in place. Now we're going to top stitch with a 1/16 seam allowance from one side of the cuff straight across to the opposite side. Then we're going to top stitch once more below that stitching line and 3/8 of an inch away from that top folded edge of the cuff. We're going to start our stitching a 1/4 of an inch away from the edge, sewing across, and then pivoting a 1/4 of an inch away from the edge on the opposite side. Continue with that 1/4 inch seam allowance along the side of the cuff and bottom edge. Then pivot once more to join at the original starting point of your stitches, back stitching to secure. All of this top stitching is illustrated in the pattern instructions. And we'll repeat this exact process to complete your opposite cuff as well. Here's the center front edge of one of my front bodice pieces. Along the top and bottom of the bodice, you have notches indicating our folding points. I'm going to fold the entire center front to the wrong side from notch to notch and press in place. This should be a 3/4 inch amount. Once that's pressed in place, we're going to fold this section on top of itself, corresponding with the next set of notches. So we're simply rolling that on top of itself and giving it a press another 3/4 of an inch to the wrong side. And replicate that pressing for the opposite front bodice piece. Here is the very bottom of my center front bodice. I'm going to unfold that last fold that we pressed and fold it back on itself along the crease line toward the front of the garment. And pin in place. Doing that for both center fronts. Then we're going to sew through all of those layers, straight across the bottom just as far as the fold with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then we can turn those bottom edges back along the original fold line, poking out the bottom corners. Now we're going to fold the entire bottom edge to the wrong side along the bottom hem by 1/2 inch. Now I'm going to take the raw edge and fold it to the crease, and then on the crease, creating a rolled hem all the way across and press in place. I'm going to sew along the bottom edge from one edge of the placket, edge stitching along that inner folded edge all the way across to the outer edge of the opposite placket. I've applied interfacing to the wrong side of my upper collar piece. Now I'll place the upper and under collar pieces right sides together along the longer single notched edge and pin in place. Sew that seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Press the under collar piece up and away from the interfaced upper collar piece so that it's laying on top of the seam allowance and give that seam a good press. Sew the under collar to its seam allowance underneath with a 1/16 seam allowance. Fold your collar pieces right sides together along the main seam and pin the side seams. And then sew the side seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Turn the collar right side out, poking out those corners, and give the collar a good press. Top stitch starting at the bottom raw edge of one side with a 1/4 inch seam allowance pivoting at both of those top edges. Here is the top neckline of the bodice pieces, and we're going to start attaching the collar. We're going to place the upper collar and the neckline right sides together. I'm going to start pinning at the center back, matching the notches. I'm going to continue pinning in place along the neckline, matching the remaining notches on the collar with the seams on the neckline. As we get to the center fronts, unfold to the folded edges for those plackets so that we don't catch them in our pinning. Now I'm going to sew the collar to the neckline from one edge of the collar straight across to the opposite edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now we're going to finish those top corners of the bodice in the same exact way as we finished the very bottom edges. We're going to unfold that second crease that we folded into the placket and fold it to the right side of the garment along the crease. So now one fold of the placket is lying on top of the collar, and pin in place along the top raw edge. Repeat on the opposite side. Sew horizontally at both of those top edges with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, just as far as the placket. Now take your bias binding piece and place it right sides together with the collar, aligning the top raw edges. Pin the binding through all thicknesses along that top edge. Sew straight across, attaching the binding along our previous stitching line with a 1/4 inch seam allowance from one side to the other. Press your bias tape up and away from the garment and over its seam allowance. Then we're going to understitch the bias tape, sewing it to its seam allowance underneath with a 1/16 seam allowance. Turn the garment over to the wrong side. Fold that top free edge of the bias tape over its seam allowance and to the wrong side by a 1/4 inch, all the way across that top edge. Now we can turn those plackets right side out, folding them to the inside of the garment along the original crease and poking out the corners. Turn the collar upward, and this bias binding seam section should be facing now down toward the garment. Now we're going to pin the folds of the plackets to the inside of the garment along those inner folds, as well as that bottom fold of the bias binding on the inside of the neckline. Now with a 1/16 seam allowance, we're going to edge stitch close to the folds of the placket, pivot along the neckline to edge stitch along the bottom folded edge of the bias tape along the neckline, and then edge stitching back down along those edges along the opposite center front to the bottom of the garment. Here is the center front edge of my right front bodice piece, and I'm going to use my pattern piece to mark the buttonhole placement. Then I'll sew each of my buttonholes in place. I've marked my button placement along the opposite left front bodice piece, and now I'll sew them in place. For the cuffs, the buttonhole will be sewn on the outer section, according to the marking on your sleeve cuff template piece. Sew both of those buttonholes in place now. Then we'll sew both of the buttons in place across from the buttonhole according to the marking on the template. Your fabricstore.com Riva long sleeve shirt is now complete. For more patterns, see the fabricstore.com website, and for additional assistance, contact them via email for one-to-one support.